Today, in the debut episode of Combo Breaker Reviews, we're going to talk about one of my all-time favorite movies. Or at least we'll talk about that movie for a minute or two before talking more in depth about its ill-fated sequel. Strap in, folks, and ready yourselves for The Quickening.
Christopher Lambert, Sean Connery, Highlander II, The Quickening.
Combo Breaker!
Calling the urban fantasy subgenre niche would honestly be putting it pretty lightly. Sure, this particular type of fantasy is really popular in the written form, but as far as film and television goes, the pickings, as far as I can see at least, are much more slim. Personally, I really like the concept of putting more fantastical storylines in modern day, particularly big city settings. In March of 1986, one of the most notable films of the genre was gifted to the world with Highlander. The film was directed by Russell Mulcahy, who was a pretty well-known music video director at the time, but in the realm of film only had one other credit, a movie about big fecking pigs.
Razorback.
The screenplay was written by Gregory Wyden, Peter Bellwood, and Larry Ferguson, and was based on a story by Wyden, who originally conceived the idea as a class project.
I was a student in the UCLA film program, and I was in a screenwriting course when I was 20 years old in 1982, and that's where I wrote the script. It was the first script I wrote as part of my coursework.
The movie followed the life journey of Connor MacLeod, played by Christopher Lambert, who is one of many immortals who, as the name implies, can live forever and survive any type of injury, with the sole exception being the loss of their head. MacLeod is trained and taught the ways of the immortals by his mentor Ramírez, played by Sean Connery, and is told to prepare for the day of the gathering, where all remaining immortals would converge to one place and fight until only one remains, and is granted the mysterious prize. Insert your very topical and trendy battle royale joke here. When one immortal beheads another, an event known as the Quickening occurs. Although in the original movie it is pretty vague what happens during the Quickening, it's insinuated that all the powers the deceased immortal had is transmitted to the victor. Connor's main nemesis throughout the film is the deadly Kurgan, played by Clancy Brown, who has been thinning out the competition centuries before the gathering even began. All the while, during these final stages of the game, Roxanne Hart's character, Brenda Wyatt, serves as our human perspective in the film, as she tries to uncover the mystery of the multiple decapitation-related murders in New York during the gathering. That's a very brief plot synopsis, something you'd see in the back of a DVD or a VHS, but it tells you basically all you need to know going into it. Highlander was a disappointment at the box office, both domestically and internationally, and reviews also tended to be pretty mixed, with some positive reviews coming from its home turf in the UK, but much more negative ones coming from the States.
I was going to save this dialogue. I thought Highlander was a completely, and thank you for laughing at that story, completely silly and very boring movie. I kept hoping for something interesting to come along and interrupt those endless sword fights.
But Highlander very quickly achieved cult status for many reasons, including its very fun action, interesting plot, the mystique around the immortals, the charm of all the characters from the protagonist,
What kept you?
the mentor,
You cannot die, MacLeod.
and even the antagonist.
Happy Halloween, ladies.
Not to mention the heart of the film, with Connor's two romantic relationships and the pathos of being immortal and watching those you love grow old and die. And last, but certainly not least, the killer soundtrack provided by none other than Queen, music which I would love to give a small snippet of here, but won't for obvious reasons. Today, Highlander definitely feels very much of its era in presentation, but I personally love that about the movie, and I do think the concept and story themselves feel timeless. The movie became a certified video store hit, and to this day is fondly remembered by its dedicated fan base, and beyond its fan base, aspects of the film are still clearly remembered in pop culture. You might have never heard of Highlander before this video, but somewhere, at some point, you've heard the mantra of the immortals. There can be only one.
There can be only one.
In the end, there can be only one.
There can be only one.
And many of the songs Queen made for Highlander, notably Princes of the Universe, have become beloved classics for fans of the band. With the newfound success of Highlander post-release, the two producers from the first film, Peter S. Davis and William N. Panzer, decided to finally do a sequel and released it in 1991 under the name Highlander II: The Quickening, which would go on to be one of, if not the most infamous movie sequel of all time. Well, at least until the original Star Wars trilogy got some sequels. Alright, that's one more topical reference. If you missed the first video where I explained the purpose of this video series, well, first off, please do that, because it'll help me out a lot. But secondly, I just want to reiterate that I won't be going super in-depth with the behind-the-scenes information as much as you would see in other videos. The purpose of Combo Breaker reviews is to simply explain what I think the shortcomings of a film are, and occasionally draw from the behind-the-scenes stuff to give potential explanations of why certain flaws exist in the movie. If you really want a good video taking a deeper dive at the actual production of this film, I'd highly recommend Oliver Harper's video on Highlander 2. On paper, certain aspects of the sequel actually look very promising. Two of the main stars return for it, although the return of one of those characters is an issue. The original's director returned, both producers returned. It did actually have a bigger budget and got a true theatrical release and wasn't straight to video despite the first movie not making that much cash at the box office. But there are two significant red flags when just looking at the big picture before even getting into the film proper. First is that the whole idea of doing a sequel is kinda sketchy in of itself. Spoilers for the first film, but if you're watching a review of the second, I'd hope you'd seen the original. But it ends with Connor MacLeod as the last immortal standing, winning the game and earning the prize. So if there's no other immortals left and Connor has the ultimate prize, who are the antagonists for the sequel and what are the stakes? So the concept of a sequel is one that would require some interesting and skilled writing to execute properly. Secondly, of all the writing staff for the first film, the story conceptor and the two guys who helped him adapt that story to the screen, only one of those individuals returned for the sequel, and it wasn't the story conceiver. But still, a smart enough writer can find a way to make a sequel work despite the ending to the original, and there's a chance that new writers coming in can achieve what worked in the original while bringing in their own vision, making the sequel still a recognizable extension of the original film, while adding in their own unique touches. Yeah, but that didn't happen.
And nothing can go wrong! Oh no, it all went wrong!
One last quick clarification before we finally get into the movie. Most of the footage I'm showing is from the special edition, simply because it's the easiest for me to pull footage from since I have it on hand already. However, the main version of the film I'll be actually discussing is the original theatrical release, since it was the initial follow-up to the film, and it was the first version I saw on VHS years ago. First, let's go over the very basic plot as it was written by Brian Clemens and producer William N. Panzer and adapted by Peter Bellwood. The movie starts with a prologue set about 14 years after the events of the first film. The deteriorating ozone layer has led to a planet-wide crisis with the rays of the sun killing a whole lot of people. Connor MacLeod and a team of scientists work together to build a giant planetary shield to protect the Earth from the sun. It's sorta kinda hinted if you squint real hard that Connor used his ultimate powers he obtained from winning the prize to achieve this, that being having essentially unlimited knowledge and being able to know what everyone is thinking, but the rest of the movie and even this prologue never directly references that ability, and the prize for the game is retconned in this film. 25 years later, the shield has caused a new crisis with the planet not getting enough energy from the sun, leading many people to blame Connor for dooming the planet a second time, even though it was done in good faith originally to save the planet. And now an evil cliché corporation owns the shield and is pulling an EA and established paywalls countries have to pay to keep it protecting the world. We also see that Connor is clearly mortal now and aging, having become an old man, and during a trip to the opera, we get flashbacks explaining the origins of the Immortals and specifically MacLeod himself and his mentor Ramírez. 500 years ago, they came from a planet known as Zeist.
What a twist!
Where the two were freedom fighters pushing back against the oppression of General Katana, played by Michael Ironside. Once the rebellion was crushed, basically the second Connor was put in charge of it, the priests of the planet have Connor Ramírez banished to Earth. Along with other prisoners, I guess, even though Katana had the rest of the rebels killed, so I don't know where the rest of the Immortals from the first movie were supposed to be from. Where they would be immortal and forced to kill one another. When only one remained, the victor could decide to stay on Earth, become mortal and die, or return to Zeist. Back in the prison, General Katana decides to have Connor killed to prevent him from returning to Zeist, and simultaneously Ramírez, who of course died in the original, comes back to life through means that can only be described as dumb movie plot convenience magic. Let's start the story issue section with what the most common critique of this film was between critics and fans alike. Explaining the origin of a franchise trait that was up until then mysterious is never a great idea. Odds are the writers will never come up with concepts that match the expectation of the fans, and often overall ruins the mystique of that particular thing. That being said, it can be done decently with the right amount of effort and knowledge of the franchise. But oh man, the Immortals and by extension our protagonists being
A fucking alien.
was not the right move at all. It's dumb, really lame and makes the Immortals less interesting because they're just a bunch of dudes from another planet and not even a cool looking planet or an interesting looking alien civilization. This feels like a really cheap way to increase the scale and scope of the film by having it be a story that quote-unquote transcends our literal world, but it just doesn't work. The whole origin for the Immortals has become an inside joke in the fanbase, something so dumb and embarrassing for the franchise. It's what most think of when this film is brought up. And even if by some miracle they somehow made this alien idea actually kind of interesting, it doesn't fix the massive plot holes it created within the film, which is a great way to segue into all the inconsistencies within this film, contradicting both the original film and even at times itself. Here are some questions the film itself never answers. If McCloud and Ramírez knew each other in Zeiss, why do they act like they never met before in the first film?
Who are you?
Why do aliens have names like McCloud, Ramírez, and Katana, which are clearly based on Earth culture? Why does Ramírez say he's been on Earth for thousands of years? The Zeiss flashback was only 500 years ago. Why does Connor have to be told about Immortals if he was very clearly present when the priest laid out the rules of the game? Why did they change what the Quickening was? If Connor just needed to call Ramírez's name to bring him back, why did he never do so in the centuries after his death and wait all the way to 2024 to do so? You'd think inevitably he would at least do it on accident. Why would General Katana wait until like 40 years after McCloud won the prize before deciding to kill him, even though it's super obvious McCloud would die in just a few more years and has no intention or reason to return to Zeiss? He literally creates his own issue, and both Connor and his random goon pointed out to him.
Find McCloud and kill him. But I thought you said McCloud was mortal and will never return. After all this time, I was ready to kick back, crawl, and die. You changed everything.
Why does Ramírez pull his whole cliche man out of time hijinks when he's from a civilization that clearly had spacecraft and teleporters? Why would the creators of the planet Shield be so competent to make something that can never be shut off lest the entire planet be destroyed? If Katana is the general of all the armies of Zeiss, why does he just send two dorks himself to kill Connor? How can the Shield Corporation get away with charging for the Shield if it can literally never be turned off? What the hell type of service are they even providing, and how would the world governments let them get away with this?
It makes no damn sense.
These are all just the biggest writing problems with the film and are not even nitpicks. They're glaring issues you'll probably notice on a first watch through. So this film is already in a really bad shape at a pure script level, but sometimes an awfully conceived story can at least be somewhat redeemed by good characters. Highlander 2 essentially has 2 returning characters and 3 new characters serving as the major players of the story. Connor McCloud thankfully doesn't suffer too much in this sequel characterization-wise, aside from being dumb when designing the shield and being one of the worst leaders in fiction history with how fast this revolution got railroaded. He has very much the same charm he had in the first movie, and Christopher Lambert gives a great performance. Well, at least when he's not doing his silly old man voice.
Hey, Jimmy. Terror is a dangerous business, Miss Marcus. Ramírez, my old friend Ramírez!
But sometimes in the theatrical version, it really feels like the film forgets him part of the way through, and the movie shifts its entire focus to what General Katana, the Shield Corporation, and Ramírez are doing before finally bringing things back to Connor. True, the first movie swapped perspectives between Connor, the Kirkin, and Brenda often, but it felt a lot more natural there in my opinion. Other than those things, there's not a lot to say about McCloud in this movie. The character is fine, and it's nice seeing his heroics as he tries to save the world twice in the film, first by building the shield and then at the end of the film destroying it, but there's no real significant development to discuss. Ramírez also doesn't do too bad in the sequel. Although his man at a time shtick does get old, it's at least a little charming, and Sean Connery is always a treat to watch perform. And when he finally reunites with Connor, the movie actually kind of becomes fun, and dare I say, even good for a short while. Their dynamic, whether it be them sparring, joking around with one another about how many times they were shot, or Ramírez still trying to teach Connor life lessons, is just really good stuff. But that being said, his entire existence in this film feels very forced writing-wise, and his removal from the film feels even more contrived and nonsensical. But that being said, I do think his inclusion was worth the retcon, just because his scenes in this movie tended to be the best parts of the train wreck. Rounding out the heroes is Louise Marcus, who is here to be Connor's new love interest, and some of the other characters get exposition dumped too, and that's about it. She doesn't feel fleshed out in the slightest, and it's actually comical how fast she becomes Connor's love interest, taking all about 5 minutes of knowing McCloud. Virginia Madsen is a good actress, and she does her best in this movie, but man did she have jack all to work with in the script. The evil CEO character of the film is played by John C. McGinley.
Bob, I got a bad feeling on this one, alright? I got a bad feeling. I don't think I'm gonna make it out of here.
And on one hand, it is pretty fun seeing him absolutely chew the hell out of his scenes and ham it up to an absurd extent, but ultimately he is your run-of-the-mill evil businessman character. I love the trope of the evil corporation in fiction and can get behind an interesting corporate entity fucking over the world, but this one really doesn't do anything for me. But hey, at least the CEO has one of the best villain deaths ever.
Maybe.
Oh my God! Oh, dick quit!
Everybody gotta die sometime, Red.
And finally, we have our new big bad, General Katana. Man, that name is so ridiculous. Played by the usually fantastic Michael Ironside. This is the one that stings the most because there could have been loads of potential here. They got a great villain actor in the role, and the idea of a prim and proper tactical genius as the main antagonist is legitimately cool and a decent way to follow up the iconic and barbaric Kurgan from the first film. But instead of actually trying to make him feel like a military general, he's more or less Kurgan 2.0. He acts like the Kurgan, he tries to have a similar brand of dark humor.
Now stop!
That's not funny. That's not funny at all.
He's very brutish and he carries a big claymore-like sword, and he even rips off entire sequences that Kurgan had in his tour as villain. He never even feels intimidating either. All the time we see him wreaking havoc, it's always towards mortals, and the only time in the film we actually see him fight another mortal, that being Connor, of course, it doesn't feel like Connor has to go above and beyond to beat him, and that's with Connor being incredibly out of experience, with his last major fight being 40 years ago.
Ashes to ashes, dust to dust. If you don't take it out and use it, it's going to rust.
This dude is a joke, and not to mention stupid, after the aforementioned plot hole of him causing his own fucking problem going after Connor in the first place. And his military victory at the beginning doesn't help either, since it doesn't feel like he outmaneuvered Connor's forces, but he just brute forced his way to victory. A much better way they could have built him up as a villain and simultaneously fixed some of those script issues is showed that the priest didn't want them to break their oath to Connor via Katana sending people to kill him, so Katana, in order to achieve this, has to perform a coup and remove the priest from power. This can lead to another Zeiss civil war, this time between those already in power, that can be said to take 40-ish years, and we jump to the end where we see Katana enter the priest's chambers and kill their elite guard in a several-on-one fight, showing his insane level of skill even against highly trained warriors and outnumbered, making him a legitimate threat to Connor. Katana then kills the priest and establishes himself as the sole ruler of Zeiss, but this civil war has caused major losses to his military, and with his power over the planet still obviously shaky this soon after victory, he can't afford to send out large portions of his forces to kill Connor, hence why he has to send Bulk and Skull, and eventually do it himself.
Fine. I'll do it myself.
A sequence like this taking priority away from scenes like him in the train, him in the taxi, and maybe even take away some of Ramírez's hijinks scenes would have made Katana a far better threat and fixed two of the instances of dumb writing in the movie. One little extra tidbit I want to stick on at the end, but I always thought it was funny that both Clancy Brown and Michael Einstein were in Starship Troopers and Justice League, and I've always wondered if they ever talked about Highlander during the production of those things, but probably not.
I'm going to carve out your heart and put it on a pike in my throne room.
As much as I'd enjoy seeing that, first you've got some business with me.
Overall, the new characters do not bring anything worthwhile to the table, outside of some really hammy acting from the villains, and the returning characters, although not bad and bring some fun to the film, cannot help this dumpster fire as much as they needed to. The editing and pacing of Highlander 2, at least the theatrical version we're discussing, is horrendous. You get the vibes the film was edited by someone who doesn't really know how to properly pace out a film, and that's not far from the truth. The editing of the film was one of the major issues during production, and it really shows in the theatrical cut of the movie.
There were holes in the film, which we hadn't done, and story points and action sequences and whatever that hadn't been shot. I don't know. It wasn't quite the film that was planned.
It starts out pretty fast-paced, but once Connor gets his immortality back, it slows down to an absolute crawl, basically all the way until like the last 15 minutes or so of the film. The whole middle part of the Quickening is a slog to sit through. The cinematography is also a considerable step down from the original. Russell Mulcahy cut his director's teeth on music videos, and the first Highlander in a lot of ways actually did feel like it was shot as a music video, and I say that as a positive. There's some really impressive shots in cinematography in displaying that film, to the point that even simple scenes like the police talking to McLeod is interesting to look at. I always think back to the scene where the Kurgan chases Brenda through her apartment and how cool it looked. Mulcahy and his cinematographer Gary Fisher really made Highlander pop visually. Contrastly, this movie feels very dull to look at. The camera work just feels incredibly basic, as if everything was decided it should be filmed, for lack of a better way of saying, matter-of-factly. No fancy or cool camera angles, very few dynamic transition techniques, just film it so we get to the next scene. Phil Mayhew is normally a very good cinematographer, so I have to chalk up to why he and Russell Mulcahy were both off their game to the production issues. The visual effects sucked too in the theatrical cut, really with the only two outliers being the first Quickening and surprisingly Connor fighting with one of the goons on the jetpack. The whole film has this shitty red sky effect that really distracts from the film and wasn't what the crew originally wanted the sky to look like. Why does that sound familiar? A lot of the set design intentionally invokes Blade Runner imagery, and although some of the exterior shots are alright in later cuts, the actual sets in my opinion look tacky. They were trying way too hard to make this look like Blade Runner, and makes it feel more like a knockoff. The way this movie was shot also does a huge disservice to the action. Older films tend to not have as flashy melee combat as we have nowadays, and it's not fair comparing the action of this, or even the first Highlander, to modern movies where we have benefited from the ever-evolving art form of fight choreography. But the fights in the original were at the very least filmed in such a way to make them feel really fun and exciting. Sure, the actual choreography is not the best, but some great camera work made up for that. Highlander 2's fights are no better than the originals, but now we have boring filming methods. So outside of the hoverboard fight, this movie has very unappealing to watch and dull fights. The music of The Quickening is pretty average. The actual score by Stuart Copeland is serviceable and definitely not bad, but it will not stick with you, which is strange since a lot of Copeland's other scores are actually great. But to be fair, I think the same thing with Michael Kamen's score from the original Highlander. Where the original exceeded music-wise, of course, were the songs made for it by Queen, and this sequel did not receive that treatment. There are songs from various artists in this one, and without comparing them to the songs Queen made, which is obviously an unfair standard, I still did not care for much of these tracks, with the only exception being the song One Dream performed by the Lou Gramm Band, which was alright. For all the preceding reasons and more, Highlander 2 is the textbook definition of a bad sequel. With film tastes as broad as they are, you're always bound to find someone who likes a movie that is generally disliked, and yet I've never seen a single person sound off that they like this movie beyond a "I love it because it's awful" reason. I'm not saying there aren't fans of this movie out there, and I'm by no means trying to shame anyone who does legitimately like it. Film and art in general is incredibly subjective after all, and I have no issue with people who like the movies that I think are dog shit, but I think it just goes to show you how poorly conceived this film was, the fact that it has so few fans out there. Years after Highlander II The Quickening released, a director's cut known as the Renegade version was released, and sought to fix a lot of the issues the movie had. And a little bit after that, another cut, the Special Edition, tried to further improve things. Between these two versions of the film, all mentions of the Immortals being aliens and from the planet Zeiss are completely removed, the visual effects were greatly improved, the pacing and editing is altered to be more cohesive, and some cut, much-needed scenes were added back in. The Special Edition is the closest the movie ever came to being good, but even it is still pretty terrible in my opinion, due to things like the plot holes and new characters that can't really be fixed in the editing room. The theatrical cut of Highlander 2 can only be found on VHS and some other formats in other regions, and we'll probably never see a wide DVD or Blu-ray release of that version of the film. And just one more final FU to the film is that none of the other Highlander media in the years since have made so much of a reference to Highlander 2, avoiding the events of that film like the plague, basically completely writing it off from franchise continuity. So how did this train wreck affect the rest of the franchise? Well, unfortunately, Highlander has never truly recovered from this film. Although The Quickening did actually make just a little more at the box office than the original did, it also had a larger budget, so it was still a certified failure. But once again, it did pretty decent home media sales, and that is probably the only reason why the franchise went on afterwards. It might have even been the deciding factor to make the next installment a television show. There have been many novel, comic, and most notably television follow-ups to Highlander, but for the next section I just want to focus on the movies that came after The Quickening. 3 years after Highlander II, miraculously a third film was released, Highlander III The Source, directed by Andy Moran, which has too many other titles for me to care to list off. This is the best live-action movie sequel to Highlander, and I know a few fans who quite like it, but personally I think the film is too much of a retread of the original, recreating several scenes beat for beat, which just makes the whole thing feel incredibly unoriginal. I get that they were worried about the backlash Highlander 2 got from deviating too far from what fans already knew, but the film just doesn't feel like it adds anything beyond some kinda cool magical abilities the main antagonist Kane has, who might I add is an even more blatant Kurgan knockoff than General Katana. This was once again another financially disappointing Highlander at the box office. In the year 2000, it was decided to cross over the films and the 6th-season Highlander TV show that had just ended its run a couple of years earlier, which, don't worry, I will plan on covering this show eventually. We saw Connor MacLeod and Connor's cousin and television show protagonist Duncan MacLeod team up, technically for the second time, since Connor was in the pilot for the TV show in Highlander Endgame, which was directed by Doug Arniokovsky. This is the Highlander film I definitely feel most mixed on. There is some good there. The action at times is actually really damn good. I think the way they crossed over Connor and Duncan's stories was decent, and big spoilers, I think Christopher Lambert's actual send-off in this film, and by extension the whole franchise, wasn't bad at all. But the film contradicts many aspects of both the film and television lore. It drags at times. Certain decisions made with Connor and Duncan's characters were very questionable, and it has potentially my least favorite antagonist of the films, beating out even General Katana. I'm more leaning towards just outright saying Endgame is really bad, but there's a couple of diamonds in the rough. Endgame continued the box office losing streak for the franchise, barely making more than Highlander II did 9 years before it. By far the best follow-up to Highlander, at least as far as movies go, is the Yoshiaki Kawajiri directed anime film Highlander The Search for Vengeance. This is pretty much the only post-original Highlander film I enjoy quite a bit. I do have some gripes with the film, don't get me wrong, and it's not on the level of the original, but it's still a pretty damn good movie. And since I've been mentioning each film's villain, since that's one of the big weak points of the franchise after the original, I'll just say that Marcus is the best movie villain after the Kurgan, and is what General Katana should have been like.
Barbarians will always be barbarians.
If I can't control them, or tame them, I might as well start all over again.
This anime did not release into theaters, so I got no box office numbers for you, and despite a warm reception, I find this to be the most overlooked installment of the franchise, and as far as I've seen, doesn't get mentioned often. But the final resting place for Highlander was in the same graveyard where other franchises like Lake Placid and Anaconda lay, the Sci-Fi Channel.
Horror. Horror.
The sixth and thus far final film in the series, Highlander The Source, was indeed a Sci-Fi Channel original movie, directed by Brett Leonard, known for such masterpieces as The Lawnmower Man, and the Man-Thing movie even the biggest Marvel fans probably didn't even know existed. The Source actually managed to do the impossible and be an even worse sequel than The Quickening for far too many reasons for me to get into right now. I have seen the original Russian release of the film that came out several months before the Sci-Fi Channel premiere, which I definitely watched through legal avenues.
FBI! Clear right!
And it actually is a bit better than the final cut, primarily due to some pacing changes, expanded scenes with the main antagonist, who is the only kind of entertaining thing about the film, and cutting the narration, but either way, the film is still awful in such a horrific way to not only close out the television timeline, but the Highlander franchise as a whole. In more recent years, there have been apparently a couple Highlander fan films officially authorized by Davis Panzer Productions under certain conditions. I do plan on watching them soon, but I want Combo Breaker reviews to be focused on official installments to a franchise, just because I tend to cut fan projects a lot more slack due to their nature, whereas within a studio production, I can critique them much more straightforward. And that's where the franchise currently stands. Highlander's time in the sun was all too short, and such a terrible sequel right out the gate can be attributed to a lot of the issues the franchise had in the long term, but I do think it's unfair to try to pin all of that on just this one film. I'm going to refrain from being too insulting to the producers of this franchise since unfortunately both have passed away, but it was a lot of the decisions made at the producer level that led to this series constantly getting into such a rut. I don't know how well the franchise would have done in the long term, management-wise, even if The Quickening had been good despite all going against it. For well over a decade now, there have been constant talks about doing a reboot of the franchise, and we've seen many directors, writers, and actors come and go from the project. As of now, Chad Stahelski, director of the acclaimed John Wick franchise, has signed on to direct a script by Ryan J. Condal, and as of 2015, Dave Bautista has been set to play the Kurgan, but who knows if he's still actually on board at this point. The reboot's current home is at Lionsgate, and I'll be honest, this is definitely one of those I'll believe it when I see it projects due to its development hell status, and I'm not the only one, as even Christopher Lambert himself, who was for years enthusiastic when asked about a reboot, has recently expressed skepticism that the project would even happen.
So, I've got bad news for you. The feature is not gonna happen.
But that being said, Ghostbusters 3 for the longest time was one of those I'll believe it when I see it projects, and we're kinda getting it with Afterlife later this year, so you never know. Here's a big PSA, Tronan, as to why you should never procrastinate. After having tossed the idea for years now to do a YouTube series like this, I very recently decided to do it, and my intentions for all those years was if I did it, I would always make the first video on Combo Breaker reviews on Highlander 2, since that is one of those franchises that has suffered dearly in the long term, and there hasn't been any significant updates on the reboot in years. And of course, after finishing off my part of the script about the lack of updates for the reboot, lo and behold, just a couple of days later, we get an update.
Wow! What do you know?
Henry Cavill of Superman and Witcher fame has been reportedly cast to play the lead in the Highlander reboot. No word on who he's playing yet, but the safe bet is clearly Connor McLeod. And he would be a really good fit for the character, and I truly hope it happens, but I'm still sticking with my previous statement. This reboot has been in development hell for years, and until cameras start rolling on the project, I will remain incredibly skeptical that it will happen. All we can do is hope that with the talent currently attached to this reboot, not only will it actually happen this time, but that perhaps this franchise can finally truly shine like it deserves to.
I have something to say. It's better to burn out than to fade away.
Actually, this challenge makes sense. Like the epic conflict between Connor McLeod and the fearsome but misunderstood Kurgan. You must both fight for the prize. You will fight only in the shadows, never in woodshop. Consider this holy ground, because I don't want you touching my stuff. The sword touches your neck or your lower head, you are out. The last one standing earns the right to lead his own Highlander club.
Or maybe there can be two?
Nope, there can be only one Highlander club.
If you watched this far, thank you so much for watching my first video all the way through. I'm pretty happy with how it turned out, but I'm sure there's definitely rough spots, and I'm 100% open to constructive criticism and advice, so feel free to leave a comment saying what you liked and what you didn't like. One last thing, I want to end these reviews with a question for you all to answer, so here we go. What's your favorite movie sword fight? I hope you all have a great day, and be safe out there.